So we're going to start looking at blood. And yes, blood is a fluid connective tissue. It's the only connective tissue that we talked about way back when we talked about tissues. That's a fluid. Now, in the plasma, or in the blood itself, we divide it into two main groups, plasma and the formed elements. I don't know if that's any better. The plasma is the non-living fluid, and it makes approximately 55% of your blood. Again, this is a review for lab. The formed elements, this is the living part of the blood because this is where you find your cells, and it makes up approximately 45% of the blood itself. Now, different cells that you're going to find inside the formed elements. Erythrocytes, what does erythro mean? Red. Leukocytes, what does leuko mean? White. And platelets, and their other nicknames. It's one of the prefixes. Is thrombocytes. The word throm has anything to do with blood clotting, with the clotting cells. Now, when we spin the blood down and we look at this percentage, that 55% plasma, 45% is formed elements, it's known as a hematocrit, this percentage difference. Now, which of the blood cells is the predominant blood cell? Red blood cells by far. Now, out of curiosity, when we put the leukocytes and platelets together, what's that called? It's at the top of the red blood cells? Buffy coat. When we look at the percentage of plasma to the formed elements, which is mostly red blood cells, that's known as a hematocrit. Now, males have approximately 47% are red blood cells, meaning their plasma is about 53%. Females have less red blood cells. Their percentage of red blood cells in their blood is only about 42%. Give or take 5%. And again, this is how we get the average of about 45%, male, female. But males do have more red blood cells than females do. We'll get more into that in a little bit. Other characteristics of blood, it has a sticky, blood is a sticky, opaque fluid with a metallic taste. Does anyone know what metal is in there? It's iron. Well, that's it too. I'm like, there is iron in there. Now, color of blood varies. It's all red. It's not blue. But it varies in shades of red. Really high oxygenated blood is a bright scarlet red. Low oxygenated blood is a very dark red, almost to the brown-black point. Your blood pH is a very narrow range. You had to know it in fundamentals. You got to know it again. Your blood pH is a narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45. It cannot change from that. If it gets below 7.35, it's known as acidosis, and now we have acidic blood traveling around the body, damaging tissues. That blood needs to maintain that pH of 7.35 to 7.45 so that the tissues will as well. Average volume, males have more blood than females. Why? Generally, they're bigger. And again, in general. Now, there are three big groupings of functions of the blood. So three big groups or three big categories of different functions of the blood. Blood has distribution functions, it's got regulation functions, and it has protection functions. Some of the distribution functions that it has, its distribution is distributing stuff, so oxygen, nutrients, dropping it off all at the different types of cells and tissues that need the oxygen and nutrients. It can transport metabolic waste, such as carbon dioxide, to the lungs to breathe out. It can transport other types of metabolic wastes, different types of acids, to the kidneys, so they can leave the body through urination. And it can also transport hormones from the endocrine system. The endocrine system, when it makes hormones, the different glands make hormone, they get into the blood supply, and that's how they travel around through the whole body. So it's transporting hormones, metabolic wastes, whether it's carbon dioxide, different types of substances, oxygen and nutrients. Those are the distribution functions. The regulation functions, again, we're regulating things. One is body temperature. It can absorb and distribute heat. Like, as we get hot, whether you're working out, things like that, we generate lots and lots of heat. Well, we can try to get rid of some of that heat in the body. What happens? What does our blood do when you're hot? It goes to you turn red. It goes to the surface of your skin to try to radiate that heat out of the body. And I'm like, it can also help absorb heat and just distribute it so that, everywhere. Now, we don't have one part of the body that's overworking and is extra hot. We distribute the heat and try to get rid of it. It also helps regulate our normal body pH. There are different buffers in our blood. So if all of a sudden something's coming into our body that's, making it too acidic or too alkaline, there are different buffers in our blood. A buffer is just something that helps regulate and maintain pH. Like, so if something's acidic, it binds to it and neutralizes it. If something's alkaline, it binds to it and neutralizes it. So it, tries to maintain that pH. And it also helps maintain adequate fluid volume in our circulatory system. The fluid volume in our circulatory system stays relatively the same. Males have approximately 5 to 6 liters for males and 4 to 5 liters for females. If you're thirsty, that number really doesn't change. And I'm like, other cells in the body can lose water, but the circulatory volume has to maintain the same so that we can still pump the same amount of blood everywhere around your entire body. And so I'm like, it helps maintain that fluid volume. So if you are starting to get thirsty, we can start pulling water out from cells so that we still maintain that same circulatory system volume. And then there are some protection functions. Well, it helps protect against blood loss. There's platelets, different types of proteins that help try to maintain blood inside the body. Helps prevent against infection. We have antibodies, and I'm like, in our plasma, and we have complement proteins that assist the antibodies in trying to find and target invaders. And we have all of our white blood cells that we find in that buffy coat that also help, protect against infections. Now, that 55% of the blood, the plasma, it's mostly made up of water. It is mostly water. Now, I probably asked this before, maybe even in fundies. I don't remember. Have you guys donated plasma before? Just you? Only one? No one else has? You should. It's good money. You just sit there and study. Anyways, I'm like, one of the main things they're going to make sure is that you are extremely hydrated. They spin their blood down and they look at a hematocrit, to know that percentage. They know if you don't have as much plasma, it's because you're not hydrated. So they're looking at, how hydrated you are before they donate plasma. Now, it's not the water in the plasma that they want. They can go to drinking fountain and get water. And I'm like, it's the other stuff that's inside of the plasma that they'll pay you for. There are over 100 dissolved solutes in your plasma. The biggest ones, the most common things in your plasma are proteins. So they're the most abundant solutes. A lot of these plasma proteins, they remain in that blood plasma. They're not taken up by cells. Cells have lots of proteins in them to do various jobs. Some proteins just hang out in the blood and in the plasma to do its own job. Most of the proteins are made in the liver, and then they stay in the blood. Now, the 3 top proteins that you're going to find in that plasma, and the first and the last one are the 2 that they're really trying to harvest because they can sell. Albumin, there are some globulins, and fibrinogen. These are the 2 that they want to pay you for, the albumin and the fibrinogen. Yes, there's also nutrients, gases, hormones, waste, other proteins, and inorganic ions. One of the things that albumin does, it can carry substances around your body by binding to it and holding on to it in your plasma. It's also a blood buffer. And so I'm like, if you're prone to the acid changing, whether it becomes too acidic or too alkaline, they can give you albumin to help regulate the acid base in your blood. It also is a major contributor of plasma osmotic pressure. This is what's going to pull water into your cardiovascular system to maintain your blood pressure. So I'm like, we need this. If we don't have this, your blood pressure could spike or it could go too far down. So I'm like, this helps maintain that volume in your blood to maintain blood pressure. The fibrinogen, we'll get a little bit to today. This helps with blood clotting. I'm like, the fibrin means fibers. I'm like, this helps with blood clotting. So people that have hemophilia, their blood can't clot, they can give them fibrinogen, and it helps with that blood clotting process. The formed elements of the cells, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets that you find in it, the only cells that are actually a complete cell are the white blood cells. Why? Because red blood cells have no nuclei and are missing most other organelles. Platelets, they're only cell fragments. There's like one cell just fragmented apart. They're just tiny little parts of a cell fragment. They don't have a nuclei either. They did. So because they're missing these key organelles, Most formed elements only survive in the bloodstream for a few days. They don't live a long time. So those the red blood cells, I'm like, do you remember, I mean, the platelets, they live the shortest amount of time. Do you remember how long platelets? They're more than a few days. Do you remember how long red blood cells live for? They're more than a few days. It's a fundamentals question. More than that. 120 days. How many months is that? You're like, oh my god, I didn't do math. It is 4 months. And I'm like, so they last, 3 to 4 months, somewhere in that range. They don't last a long time. Platelets last even longer, or last even shorter periods of time. Most blood cells, red, white, or platelets, originate in the bone marrow. Once they're made, they do not divide. So we start off like one stem cell that makes other cells, but once you make a cell, it doesn't undergo its own mitosis. Different cells, that looks familiar from the lab anyways. Erythrocytes, we're going to look at first, because these are the top cells that we're going to find in our formed elements. Erythro meaning red, because you're going to see erythro and lots of other stuff. Structures about them, they have a biconcave shape, because it dips in on either side. Main reason why it has a biconcave shape, it lost its nucleus. Nucleus is the biggest organelle in the cell. It lost that, and it forms this biconcave shape. It essentially has really no other organelles inside of it. The diameter itself is a wide cell. So the diameter of it is actually bigger than most capillaries. Now I flipped around a couple bullets, but I'm like, the diameters of a red blood cell is bigger than capillaries. Why is that bad? Yeah, I'm like, if you can't get the red blood cell into the capillary, you can't drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. So red blood cell got around this. It has other proteins. It has a plasma membrane protein called spectrin. And with that and some other proteins, it allows the red blood cell to fold. I mean, it's a pretty flat cell. I'm like, it's like a little inner tube. You could fold it if you wanted to. So you've got a protein spectrin that allows the red blood cell to fold, and then it can get into the capillaries wherever it needs to go and drop off the oxygen. Now, inside of that red blood cell, it's filled with a ton of a structure known as hemoglobin. This is a red pigment, and this is the particular molecule that's there for gas transport. Which two gases? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, and we'll get into more shortly on the hemoglobin part, but red blood cells are also the major factor contributing to blood viscosity. What's viscosity mean? Similar to that. It has, not pressure. If I say a fluid is very viscous, syrup is really viscous, molasses is very viscous. It's like how thick it is. The more red blood cells, the more formed elements, the thicker your blood is. If you have very few red blood cells, your blood becomes more thinner. We'll talk on how that can become bad too. Now, the structural characteristics, the fact that it's that biconcave shape, I'm like, it gives it a huge surface area, so it can pick up lots of oxygen, drop off lots of carbon dioxide. It has lots of 97%, lots of hemoglobin. 97% of that red blood cell is hemoglobin, not counting the water that's inside of it. So 97% of the stuff that's inside that red blood cell, all hemoglobin. Now, there are also no mitochondria, which is known for making ATP. So all the ATP that this red blood cell makes is all anaerobic. It goes through that glycolysis. It can take sugar, make ATP. It can do it quickly, doesn't make lots of it, but that's all right. Mitochondria, when we talked about the different steps of making ATP, if you used mitochondria, what gas do you also need for making ATP? You need oxygen. That's the anaerobic process. Need oxygen, happens in the mitochondria, makes lots of ATP. We don't want oxygen to be needed by a red blood cell. So our red blood cells don't consume the oxygen they transport. You're not a very good transporter of something if you consume what you're transporting. It's like you wouldn't be a very good pizza delivery guy as if you consumed all the pizza while you were delivering it. I'm like, same thing. The red blood cells, they don't want to consume the oxygen they're transporting. So any ATP they make, it's all anaerobic. They don't have any mitochondria that don't need it. They don't want to. So it's a nice example of that complementarity of structure and function. how that red blood cell is structured is perfect for its function. It's a very efficient very efficient oxygen carbon dioxide carrier. Now, more about that hemoglobin structure that makes up most of the red blood cell. One, the globin part of the hemoglobin is composed of 4 polypeptide chains. Now, first, what's a polypeptide? Something that's going to become a protein. I'm going to flip back and forth between the next picture and this one. So here's my hemoglobin structure. Now, Mike, I've got, well, you can see the shade difference. I'm like 2 darker structures in the top. These are my 2 beta chains, 2 little polypeptide chains on the bottom. These are my alpha chains. It's got, oops, got to go backwards. So it's got 4 polypeptide chains. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the heme part of the hemoglobin is another molecule that's bonded to each globin chain. So if you have one heme pigment bonded to each polypeptide, how many hemes do you have? 1 per polypeptide, or a total of 4. So I have 4 heme molecules for every 1 hemoglobin. So I got 4 hemes on 1 hemoglobin. Now, the middle of the heme has an iron. There's your iron. If you didn't remember, Fe means iron on the periodic table. There's the iron right in the middle of that heme molecule. It is at that iron molecule. Iron likes to pick up oxygen. It's actually what causes rust too, iron oxide. That iron is what holds on to oxygen. It likes to hold on to oxygen. That's where oxygen is going to be bound. Now, each hemoglobin molecule can then transport 4 oxygen. So each heme carries 1 oxygen for a total of 4 oxygens for 1 hemoglobin. Getting ready for some math? Now, each red blood cell, 1 red blood cell, contains 250 million hemoglobin molecules. 1 red blood cell, 250 million of these guys. So how many oxygens can 1 red blood cell carry? 250 million times the...
Oh, million, okay.
It is 1,000 million, which is the... What's 1,000 million? Billion. It's 1 billion. 1 red blood cell can potentially carry up to 1 billion oxygen molecules. Now, I was going to say, I'm like, it doesn't always, Mike, it doesn't always max out at 1 billion. I'm like, you'd have to be breathing in like pure oxygen all the time. But it can potentially hold a lot of oxygen for 1 red blood cell. All right, when these red blood cells pick up oxygen, we produce a structure known as oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin that picked up oxygen. We now call it oxyhemoglobin.
Oxygen?
Yep, so it picked up oxygen, and we formed something known as oxyhemoglobin. Most of those iron molecules now have lots of oxygen. Now, when we drop off the oxygen at the tissues, we now have something known as deoxyhemoglobin. Now, whether you have that first page or not, what does DE mean? Removing. So when we drop off oxygen, we removed it, and so now we have deoxyhemoglobin. We also call it a reduced hemoglobin. This, makes a darker red color, oxygenated, not oxygenated, bright red if it has lots of oxygen. Now, after we drop off oxygen at tissues, we can also pick up carbon dioxide. And like when these hemoglobins pick up lots of carbon dioxide, it produces something known as carboaminohemoglobin. The carbo for the carbon dioxide, amino, because carbon dioxide does not bind to the iron. It binds to some of the amine groups. I was going to say they don't really show them on here. I'm like, some of the ends, and I'm like, make some of the amine groups. And I'm like, so the carbon dioxide doesn't bond the exact same place oxygen does. It does bond on there, and not all of it, but it pick up, the hemoglobin can pick up some of the carbon dioxide. Some of the carbon dioxide otherwise stays in the actual plasma itself without actually going into the hemoglobin molecules. So some of it gets bound in the hemoglobin, some stays in plasma. But when it goes into the hemoglobin, it's carboaminohemoglobin. Now, that iron, so I'm going to talk about one other fact. That iron molecule, so it likes to pick up the oxygen. However, there are two other things that if it's exposed to, it would rather pick up. Any guess? Not dioxide. Carbon monoxide. And so I'm like, have you heard of carbon monoxide poisoning? Yes. And I'm like, if you are in any type of environment where there's carbon monoxide, your hemoglobin would rather pick up a carbon monoxide than an oxygen. Why is that bad? How do you die?
Because you don't get oxygen.
You don't get oxygen to any of your cells anymore. And yes, that causes fatigue and you're tired because you're not getting oxygen. You don't even realize that that's why you're tired, is because you're not getting oxygen. People usually fall asleep and they die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, it also, other than, I'm like, if you're anywhere where there's lots of pesticides, pesticides will bond really easy to that iron as well. So I'm like, if you're in an environment where they're spraying pesticides, your red blood cells are going to pick up those pesticides and not pick up oxygen. So it also decreases your oxygen activity. Most people don't die from pesticide breathing in because that's usually a short period of time and you're done. Repeated exposure can cause that. Now, people that, are in a house that had lots of carbon monoxide, that doesn't mean all of a sudden they can go outside and be like, I'm cured. I'm like, what happens? I'm like, these iron, they love the carbon monoxide. They don't want to give up the carbon monoxide. So it takes a long time for your body to eventually, all those hemoglobin molecules, to release the carbon monoxide and pick up oxygen. They give them straight oxygen to breathe in, but the red blood cells don't really want to pick them up because they're holding on to the carbon monoxide. So it takes a while. So even if you remove someone from a house and they're alive briefly, they still might die. They still might not get enough oxygen to their tissues. All right, the making of cells. Now, again, I don't know how many of you have that first page with prefixes or not. What does heme mean? It means blood. Anytime you have, heme in something, sometimes they even leave out the H and just something means blood related. Poiesis means making. So we're going to talk about hematopoiesis, the making of blood. So where do all these blood cells come from? How do they all start, and how do they become one blood cell or the other? Now, most blood cells are formed in red bone marrow, and in an adult, that would be found in the axial skeleton. What part of the body is the axial skeleton? Yeah, the skull, the rib cage, and I'm like, all the vertebrae and all that. I'm like, that's your axial division. That's where you're going to find most of your red bone marrow in an adult. You can also find it in the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and in the femurs, where they're going to have lots of, still have lots of bone marrow. Now, all blood cells, whether it's a platelet, whether it's a white blood cell, whether it's a red blood cell, all starts off as something known as a hematopoietic stem cell. Now, based on the name, what does it mean?
Blood-making stem cell.
It's a blood-making stem cell. Or it also has another name called hemocytoblast. And like I see it used interchangeably. Based on hemocytoblast, what does it mean?
Cell making.
Yeah, making blood cells. And I'm like, blasts are builders. He means blood. Cyto means cells. It's making or building blood cells. So I'm like, it's nice. A lot of these things, if you know the word parts, it tells you what it does. So a hemocytoblast or hematopoietic stem cell, they are the blood-making cells. So all cells start off as these cells. So they give rise to all formed elements, all cells, and then it's different hormones, different growth factors that tell that stem cell which type of cell to become. A red, a white, a platelet. And once it starts becoming one, it becomes committed and can't change. It can't just start becoming a red blood cell and be like, oh, just kidding, we need more white ones now, and then start becoming another cell. Once it starts to change, it becomes committed and it will become a red blood cell. So we're going to look at the red blood cells. So red blood cell production, it's known as erythropoiesis, which means?
Making red blood cells.
Yeah, making of red blood cells. Now, the stages. So this stem cell, My hematopoietic stem cell, my hemocytoblast, again, that's my first thing that will always be the first thing. It will become, I was going to say, I don't have the days on there, a pro-erythroblast, based on its name. What do you think it means? A building, eryther, red, and pro means before. So it's like building the early or before red blood cells. So the stem cell will get transformed into that pro-erythroblast. Once it's become a pro-erythroblast, it's now committed. No matter what happens from now on, it's going to become a red blood cell. And I'm like, something changed. It was now a red blood cell. And it has eryther in it, so you know it's going to be red blood cell. In about a 15-day period, about 2 weeks, it will go from that pro-erythroblast, go through several changes. We're not going to go through all the different changes, and become something known as a reticulocyte. Now, this reticulocyte will then go into the bloodstream. It will leave the bone marrow, go into the bloodstream, give it a couple days, and then it forms its fully formed erythrocyte. So they can actually look at how many reticulocytes are in the blood and get a pretty good accurate what your red blood cell count will be the next day. And I'm like, because all these reticulocytes, give it a day or two, become erythrocytes. You don't have to know all of this, no. So 15 days, pro-erythroblast. I would know reticulocytes, because that goes then to the bloodstream, and you can detect that, when they draw blood, and then becomes the erythrocyte. Now, interesting thing happens before it becomes that reticulocyte. I circled it. What's happening here? It loses the nucleus. A red blood cell does not have a nucleus. It did have a nucleus in development. It lost it. It got kicked out. So it lost that nucleus. It did have one, but it lost it. I was going to say into the tissue and just nope, it just gets broken down. The body just breaks it down. It recycles as much as it can. Now, regulating the making of red blood cells. So regulating erythropoiesis, the making of red blood cells. We don't want too many, we don't want too few. Too few red blood cells leads to tissue hypoxia. What's that mean? Yeah, too little oxygen to your tissues. Not good. We don't want too few of red blood cells. However, too many red blood cells leads to, increased blood viscosity, which means the blood starts to get too thick. That's also not good either. When your blood becomes too thick, it gives you, it increases your chance of strokes and heart attacks. And I'm like, the blood's too thick to get where it needs to go. We make, on average, normal rate, about 2 million red blood cells every second. It's a lot of red blood cells. What do you think how long you've been sitting here already? You're in the billions of red blood cells that you've made since you've been here. Now, two main things control the making of red blood cells. Hormones, and we'll talk about one major hormone that controls it, and diet. So you need iron, amino acids, proteins, and B vitamins to make red blood cells. So the hormone, the main hormone, you're going to have to know it. I will ask on it on your quiz next week and your test next week. You will have to know this hormone, erythropoietin, based on its name. What does it do? It helps make red blood cells. This is the hormone that will trigger your bone marrow to make red blood cells. So it's the direct stimulus for erythropoiesis, making of red blood cells. We always have a small amount in our blood. And I'm like, so that we always are making that 2 million red blood cells every single second. If we have too many red blood cells, or our oxygen levels get high enough, or we don't need any more red blood cells, it will depress the production. It will stop the making of red blood cells so we don't have too viscous of blood. But its main job is to make red blood cells all the time. Now, erythropoietin is made in the kidneys. Some comes from the liver, but it's mostly made in the kidneys. What is the kidney's normal job?
To regulate weight.
Yeah, I'm like, it's to get rid of waste products, make urine, it filters the blood. However, although it does filter some blood and get rid of waste, it makes a hormone that helps with the making of red blood cells. So when we do urinary system, you'll see this come up again. And it does that, in response to hypoxia. If you ever have too low of oxygen count, that erythropoietin will trigger the more making of red blood cells. Now, dialysis patients have low red blood cell counts. If the kidney is failing, and that's why they're in dialysis, the kidneys are failing. They're not making enough erythropoietin. They're not going to, your body's not going to be stimulated to make all those red blood cells. Now, my little notes on here with EPO. Some athletes abuse artificial EPO to the dangerous consequences. Interesting fact, as I was talking about this last night, I did actually have a student in my class last night that's like, oh yeah, in high school I totally took that. I'm like, awesome. And I'm like, which is good because then I also found out you can buy that in GNC. He's like, I got it online, but you can buy it at GNC.
What is that?
And it's got some weird funky name that you buy it.
I mean, for what?
And I'm like, why do you think athletes would want to take EPO? And I'm like, you'd make more red blood cells, which you can carry oxygen easier. You're not going to get tired as fast. I'm like, so you don't get tired as fast. And it's actually pretty, it happens pretty quickly. That EPO tells your body to start making red blood cells, and within a day or two, you've got more red blood cells. You've got a higher increased risk, or a higher increased oxygen capacity. The dangerous consequence, too many red blood cells, your blood becomes thicker, and yeah, I'm like, you can die from heart attacks and stroke, which we decided to make him feel guilty. Now, testosterone also enhances EPO production. This is why, way back when, I'm not going to scroll through my things, I'm like, males have more red blood cells. Their percentage of red blood cells to plasma is higher. They have more EPO. They have more red blood cell making hormone in it. That's just because of the testosterone. So it does result in a higher red blood cell count in males, which is why I always think that means, maybe that's the reason my husband can get up and just one day go run 5 miles and I can't. He's got more red blood cells. He doesn't tire as quickly. I don't know. All right, some other things that can control the making of red blood cells. That erythropoietin really is going to be kicking in when you've got some type of hypoxia, when you don't have enough oxygen for your body to do its job. Now, reasons that might cause hypoxia to trigger that erythropoietin, if you have a decreased number of red blood cells due to hemorrhaging or your red blood cells are being destroyed. Now, your red blood cells can be destroyed if you've been given the wrong blood type, if you've been given like straight water in an IV. We saw that, I think, on a little video. You saw red blood cells bursting. If you've got red blood cells bursting, it's not good. If you're hemorrhaging, if you've just had a surgery and lost lots and lots of blood, you're going to have a decreased number of red blood cells. That erythropoietin is going to kick in and say, let's make more. If you have insufficient hemoglobin, if you don't have enough hemoglobin in your red blood cells to carry enough oxygen, it causes the making of more red blood cells. Or if you have a reduced availability of oxygen. I'm like, it could be if you've gone to high altitudes. If you've ever gone up to the top of a mountain and then tried to run, you're tired really, really fast. I'm like, you don't have as much oxygen you're breathing in. If you have respiratory issues, you also might not be getting enough oxygen. Like if your lungs aren't working to their full capacity, you're not getting enough oxygen to your red blood cells to travel throughout the body. That would all trigger the making of red blood cells through that hormone, erythropoietin. So, kind of looking at one of these, we did some of these diagrams, the homeostasis, and I'm like, if your red blood, or if your oxygen level decreases, due to any of these things that we just talked about, if that oxygen level in your blood decreases, the kidneys release that erythropoietin. Tells the red bone marrow, what bone is this? Okay, femur. And I'm like, it tells the red blood cell, or it tells the bone marrow to start making more red blood cells. You have more red blood cells, your oxygen carrying capacity has increased again. Is this a positive or a negative feedback? Negative feedback. Something goes down, we reverse it, we bring it back up. So it's that erythropoietin that's always stimulating the making of the red blood cells. Now, other than that hormone, the other thing that, is necessary for the making of red blood cells are all your dietary things. You do need lots of nutrients. You need amino acids, you need proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, all in your diet. You also need iron, and I'm like, in your diet. Now, 65% of all the iron in your body is stored in the hemoglobin. Is all the little iron molecules at the middle of those hemes. So 65% of the iron is stored in hemoglobin that's in your body. The rest of the iron in your body is stored in the liver, the spleen, and the bone marrow. Iron has to be bound up to something. An iron ion all by itself is actually a toxic substance. So I'm like, it's bound to something. It might be to oxygen, it might be to something else, but it's bound up. But most of it's in hemoglobin. Now, iron, and I won't ask you numbers, But males, I'm going to do this wrong, females need 1.7 milligrams of iron in their daily diet. Males need 0.8 milligrams. Now, I won't ask you numbers, but I might ask you why. Why do females need so much more? I mean, twice as much iron in their diet compared to a male. Lose blood every month. Menstrual period. You're losing blood every single month, which means you have to make even more red blood cells, even more hemoglobin, which is iron in the middle of it. And I'm like, females need more iron in their diet because of the menstrual period. We also need vitamin B12 and folic acid that make sure that DNA is, working correctly when we're making all the different stages of the red blood cell after it's a stem cell. So we need different parts maintaining the health of our stem cells and the developing red blood cells. Now, our red blood cells, they don't live very long. Again, 100, 120 days, 3 to 4 months. There's no protein synthesis, so there's no transcription, translation, any of that. They don't grow. They don't divide. There's no mitosis. It's like they're made and then do their job, and then 3 to 4 months later they die. Now, old red blood cells are fragile, which isn't good. The hemoglobin starts to degenerate. It starts to not do its job anymore. So we need to get rid of these dying, dead, red blood cells that are in our body. Most of them get trapped in the spleen. So some get trapped into, certain circulatory channels, and we eventually try to filter it to the spleen. The spleen is nicknamed, and write this down, the red blood cell graveyard. That's where most red blood cells go, is to the spleen. Graveyard. Where they go to die, if they're not already dead. Now, once in the spleen, macrophages get rid of them. What does a macrophage mean? Yeah, it's like a big eater. It breaks them down. It gets rid of it, engulfs it, and, they're gone. However, though, our body, it's like it likes to go green. We try to recycle as much stuff as possible that's in that red blood cell. So, in that hemoglobin, so inside that spleen, as we start to break it down, the heme and the globin are separated. The iron that's in the heme, we reuse it. Like, we try to reuse that iron as much as possible. The heme part, after we take the iron out, gets degraded to a yellow pigment known as bilirubin. Heard of it? Now, once it gets into the bloodstream, if enough of it gets into the bloodstream, which it shouldn't, what does that cause? You turn yellow. Jaundice. And I'm like, which we'll get to that later. But that heme molecule gets turned into a pigment known as bilirubin. The liver is going to grab onto that bilirubin and then secrete bilirubin into the intestines. So we're taking that yellow pigment, we secrete it into the intestines. It gets degraded down to another pigment known as urobilinogen. I don't really care about that protein or that pigment. However, that pigment leaves the body in the feces as another pigment. Any guess what color this pigment is? Brown. So that yellow bilirubin eventually gets, broken down, turns into it's like 3 different pigments. It's like one pigment turning into another pigment, turning into another pigment, and eventually turns into that stercobilin, that brown pigment, and leaves as feces, leaves in your feces, and that's what makes your feces brown. It's always brown. It's because your red blood cells are constantly getting broken down. I mean, you're making 2 million a second. You're losing a lot of them too. It's almost like you make 2 million a second, you lose 2 million a second. So we always have the same amount. All those red blood cells, they're breaking down to red blood cells, is what makes your feces brown. The globin part, the 4 protein polypeptide chains, they get metabolized, broken down into amino acids, they get released into the circulation, and they can get reused again to make different types of proteins. So we do try to reuse as much as possible. The heme part, that will leave our body, but otherwise we reuse the iron, we reuse all the amino acids. Now, anemia, have you heard of this? Yes, and I'm like, based on its name, if you put the letter A at the beginning of something, what does it mean? Sometimes AN, without, and I'm like, the word means like without blood condition. It just means you have a abnormally low oxygen carrying capacity. Now, anemia itself is not a disease. You can't go to the doctor and be like, oh my God, you've got the disease anemia. It's like totally contagious and stuff. And I'm like, it's not a disease. it's usually some type of sign or symptom of some other type of disease. And I'm like, you might have some type of, chronic lung disease or whatever, and your lung's not doing its job properly. It could lead to anemia. It's just a sign, and you can treat it. People that have had, has anyone had anemia before? No? And I'm like, it's usually accompanied by fatigue if you're just tired all the time. Pallor, you start to go a little pale, shortness of breath, and chills. Now, causes of anemia. A lot of it's blood loss. If you've ever had some type of surgery and lots of blood loss, you're losing lots of red blood cells. You have a low oxygen carrying capacity. You're tired and you're pale. If you have a low red blood cell production, if for whatever reason that erythropoietin's not kicking in, there's something wrong with the bone marrow that it's not making enough red blood cells. We're just thinking of another one too. Can't think of it right now. Anytime you just not, you don't make enough red blood cells that your body needs, you have anemia. Oh, the other one, I'm like, if you don't have enough iron in your diet, you're not going to make enough red blood cells. It can lead to anemia. That's usually the main reason people have anemia, is low iron diet. Or if you have a high red blood cell destruction, again, you had a bad blood transfusion, or they gave you straight, water, something like that. If your red blood cells are being destroyed, you have a low oxygen carrying capacity. Now, talking about anemia, have you heard of anemia called sickle cell anemia? Yes, instead of that normal round red blood cell, it forms what they call the sickle shape. That's a sickle, little farm thing. Usually it looks like death is carrying that around. Anytime you see it. Sickle cell anemia. Now, that whole hemoglobin thing, a lot of it's the proteins that make the beta and alpha chains in hemoglobin. In that protein chain that makes hemoglobin, there are 146 amino acids that line up. 146 amino acids. And they have to be in a very specific order for 146 amino acids to make correct hemoglobin. When number 6 changes from glucine to valine, you now have sickle cell anemia. It's a genetic thing. You are born with it, whether you're going to make, correct cells or whether you're going to make incorrect cells. But out of 146 specific amino acids in one change, all it takes is one single little amino acid change, and now you have sickle cell anemia. And this is showing an actual red blood cell and actual sickle cell. Now, so those red blood cells are crescent-shaped when they unload the oxygen. And so, like, anytime they drop off the oxygen, they form that little crescent shape. And so, like, the blood, or if you have low blood oxygen, it'll form that little crescent shape. Now, these little crescent-shaped red blood cells, the problem with having that, one, they can break apart, rupture easily. They can also block small blood vessels. Why is that bad? Yeah, blood can't get through. You're not going to get oxygen to different parts of the body. So you've got poor oxygen delivery and now pain. You've all sat on your foot before, and you got up, and you had all that painful, stinging little pins and needles. That happens all the time for people that have sickle cell anemia, and it's not because they sat on a foot. It's because now different parts of the body are not getting oxygen, and they have that painful pins and needles all the time to different parts. Because they get some other blood vessels are small. Now, it is something, because you have low oxygen delivery, they can rupture, it can cause death. Now, diseases, genetic diseases that can cause death, in general, over time, you should see these diseases start to die off. Like, if you've got diseases that cause death, you'd think your number would start going down, people would start dying of it, and they wouldn't have kids, and so on. However, the disease seems to persist. Now, most people that come from, the African malarial belt and their descendants have a really high case of sickle cell anemia. Main reason for this, in the African malarial belt, right on the equator there, where there's lots and lots of malaria, which kills about 1 million people a year, kills 1 million people a year, lots of people have sickle cell anemia. One, if you have 2 copies of this gene, which means both parents had it, and they each gave you the gene that causes sickle cell anemia, you've got sickle cell anemia and that can kill you. That's not a good thing. The however is, if you only have 1 copy, which means only one parent had sickle cell anemia, which means you only have 1 copy of the gene, you have a milder case of the disease that shouldn't kill you, and you're not going to die from malaria. It's pretty rare if you've got sickle cell anemia of dying from malaria. And I'm like, because malaria is something that gets into the bloodstream. Well, if you've got one case, it seems to be able to, save you. So it is something that still persists, because even though, when you're a carrier, you don't really have the disease itself. You're not going to have all the pain and everything. You're going to have a few symptoms. But now you're like immune to malaria, and then you survive and pass on that gene. Now, for people that have it, like have the full-blown 2 copies and everything, a lot of times they'll treat you with transfusions. They take out your red blood cells, they replace it with normal red blood cells so they can do their oxygen carrying capacity. They can also inhale nitric oxide, which is supposed to promote, and I'm like, I shouldn't say, I'm like, promote normal red blood cells or prevent that sickling of the red blood cells so the red blood cells don't fold. The main thing they're trying to work on is just how is it they can prevent a red blood cell from folding over and forming that sickling shape. They're looking at blocking certain red blood cell ion channels, they're looking at stem cell transplants, and they're looking at gene therapy. Maybe we can transplant all those stem cells in the bone marrow with normal ones. Maybe we can somehow replace and change your genes so that you start making normal red blood cells and not that, bad amino acid in there. All right, so review. Pull out your colored note cards. And after centrifuging of the listed blood components, which contains components of the immune function? It's the Buffy coat. What's in the Buffy coat? White blood cells, and platelets, but it's the white blood cells that help with that immune function. A major function of the most common plasma protein, which is albumin, is to do what? It is the green, which really should say P&O. It helps maintain plasma osmotic pressure, which is going to help maintain blood volume, blood pressure. And it also has, buffering abilities so that your plasma pH doesn't change. Red blood cells, this is a long one, are efficient oxygen transport cells of the following characteristics, which is the major contributor to the significant oxygen carrying capacity of a red blood cell. What makes red blood cells so efficient at carrying oxygen? That's the easier way to say it. What makes red blood cells so efficient at picking up oxygen? It is the yellow. And I'm like, they have that biconcave discs, which makes it so they've got a greater surface area. Each hemoglobin can transport how many oxygen atoms? Just 4. One hemoglobin carries 4. Each heme picks up 1. Oxygen binds to the what part of hemoglobin? It binds to the iron atom, which again would rather pick up carbon monoxide. It binds to the iron atom and it becomes something known as oxyhemoglobin. A patient with low iron levels would experience which of the following symptoms? An increase of fatigue, they get tired. If you don't have enough red blood cells, you don't have enough oxygen. Predict the outcome of an overdose of the hormone erythropoietin. And you don't have to read very far. It is the pink one. My little note, what is the abbreviation for erythropoietin? EPO. And I'm like, I use, a lot of times in the PowerPoint, and you'll see throughout, I'm like, I just start writing EPO. It's also easier to say EPO than erythropoietin. So just so you know, EPO. Let me stop this. Don't leave yet.